Hello and welcome to Policy Watch, your packed snapshot of the week's biggest business developments, their context, their relevance and their impact. I'm Govindraj Ethiraj. Well, there's relief for domestic gas users with the NDA government deciding to postpone a hike in gas prices by at least 3 months. The Union Cabinet decided to implement a hike only after a comprehensive review of the formula suggested by Dr. C. Rangarajan. It's not clear whether a new panel will be formed to carry out this review. While the decision comes as a relief to the common man, it is seen as a big setback to domestic gas producers like Reliance Industries, who were hoping for the implementation of the new price after a period of 4 years. The new gas price was to come into effect from 1st April this year, but the previous UPA government had deferred its implementation by 3 months thanks to the beginning of the election process. The Rangarajan formula is expected to take the price of domestically produced natural gas from $4.2 per unit to above $8 per unit. This will increase the cost of power and fertilizers and price of compressed natural gas or CNG and piped natural gas. Now, estimates say the power tariffs could go up by 2 rupees and the price of CNG by 12 rupees per unit if the formula put forth by Dr. C. Rangarajan were to be implemented. Well, joining me now in the studio to discuss this are two economists, Sonal Varma, India Economist at Nomura Securities, and Madan, Sabnavis, Chief Economist at CARE. Thank you very much for joining us. So let's get a sense of where we stand on the whole subsidies and prices of fuel issue. And Sonal, let me begin with you. What are we looking at today? I mean, right, there is an external environment which is not looking very good thanks to all the problems in Iraq. There's an internal problem which is inflation and then all the other problems that may come because of delayed monsoon. So describe to us what the broader situation is, then we'll come to what the impact of prices could be.
I mean, the last 3 years obviously have been pretty bad and challenging for the Indian economy. We've had this issue of high inflation, high fiscal, current account which was blowing up, growth slowdown. I think finally in the last 6 months or so, things are starting to stabilize. There are signs that growth is stabilizing. There's some disinflation, visible, current account has narrowed. One of the challenges that still remains, and to an extent, if you see the fiscal deficit has also come down from 6% of GDP to 4.5% of GDP. But the challenge is really in terms of the composition of the consolidation and how it has been achieved.
Okay.
The 4.5% fiscal deficit for FY14, a lot of payments have not been made, especially on subsidies, and therefore the real fiscal deficit is probably higher than what is there on the account. So I think the key point therefore and the key challenge for us here is to go on that path of fiscal consolidation, have a medium-term roadmap on consolidation, and have a credible roadmap on consolidation.
Right. So you're saying there is a subsidy bill which is obviously much larger, which is lurking around the corner, and plus there is the prospect that if prices were to go up, then the subsidy bill could increase beyond what has been accounted for.
There's already a lot of under recovery in any case on LPG, kerosene and diesel. With prices going up, obviously the challenge goes up even further. So there's a lot of backlog that in any case has to be cleared in order for demand also to rationalize and for the government to be able to use that money which is currently blocked in subsidies for something that is more productive.
Right. Okay. So Madan, how are you looking at it, right? Whether or not we had a gas price hike, what would it have meant or could mean on the downstream end?
See, actually, if you look at the situation today, we have a case where there is high inflation. It's being caused primarily on account of food items over which we have little control. Then there's of course the fuel component over which actually we have control. So I would say to a very large extent it's administered inflation by the government, and this is where we have an ideological problem. I mean, do we want to really give more subsidies for the public, which has been contested by lots of people saying that it's not the right way to go. But any kind of rationalization of subsidies, especially on the fuel side, because now if you're talking of gas prices, it would also be affecting the overall fertilizer subsidy bill, because the fertilizer prices are going to get affected by it. So if I do any kind of compromise on my subsidy bill, it would invariably mean that somebody will have to bear the cost, which means that a common man has to bear the cost, which means it's going to be higher inflation. So I think this is a kind of an ideological tussle which is there. I mean, one part is of course to say that whether all subsidies are desirable, whether they're being channeled in the right direction or the right people getting it. But I think more important is that any kind of cut on the subsidies is going to have impact on inflation.
So let's look at both the scenarios. Subsidies will come to in a moment. So assuming gas prices were hiked to $8 as is desired by some, what would it have meant downstream?
See, automatically it will mean that your cost of power will go up, cost of fertilizers will go up.
For who?
So it will go up for the end user ultimately.
Okay.
Because if I'm saying power tariffs are going to go up, you and I will also have to pay high high
will
cost
that
for
apply
electricity.
uniformly across the country?
It depends upon how much of these plants are actually based on or gas based the way in which it's transmitted. Similarly, about fertilizers, what kind of fertilizers we're talking of, nitrogenous or potassium fertilizers. But whichever way it is, it's finally going to get translated into higher prices of food commodities. So fertilizer price goes up. To the extent you're not subsidizing it, the farmer will have to pay a higher cost for the inputs, which will mean that your input cost goes up and the prices of food items go up. So whichever way it is, it's going to any kind of increase in gas prices is going to necessarily mean higher prices of in terms of your WPI and your CPI.
No, so I'm trying to understand, is there a sort of domino effect on the entire economy, or is it only a part of it?
No, see, it starts off, Govind, by saying it's going to affect your overall inflation. It means it's going to affect the commodity prices.
Sure.
And the moment your inflation goes up, it has ramifications for monetary policy. Today, RBI has made it very clear that their monetary policy or any kind of action on interest rates is going to be linked to CPI inflation. So as long as I have this lurking fear that my subsidies or maybe gas prices are going up, it's not going to be compensated for through subsidies. It will automatically mean that my inflation remains high. As long as inflation is high, interest rates remain high. And one of the grievances of industry is that high interest rates means I'm not going to invest today. I have surplus capacity, no need for me to invest.
You're saying in some ways
so it's going to affect the overall economy.
And it's not therefore desirable today.
It may not be desirable today, exactly.
Okay.
I would say, or maybe I don't know how the pricing would go, whether you do it in little bits and in phases, so that the impact is sort of cushioned until such time that overall inflation is more bearable.
Okay, so let's look at the external side now. So if let's say things continue as the way they are in Iraq, or there is uncertainty on the oil front, what is the impact that we're looking at on the economy as a whole, particularly in the next 3 months?
I mean, essentially, it depends on, first of all, this is a supply side shock, right? If there's an increase in oil prices because demand is picking up, then the impact is quite different. But it also depends on how long the shock sustains. If it's a 15 or a 30-day shock which is going to fade off, then actually there is not going to be too much of an impact. But if there's a sustained, let's say a $10 increase in oil prices, sustained, meaning it sustains.
So what's your comfort zone, if one may say so, and what's the point at which you would start getting worried?
I think if you look at last 6 to 9 months, actually oil prices have been fairly range bound, around 105, 110. But assuming there's a $10 shock on top of that, typically you will see things like, current account deficit going up by about 0.5% of GDP. Under recoveries on the fuel side will go up, so that's another 20 basis point on GDP. The impact will be more on WPI inflation than on CPI inflation, but surely there will also be some impact on the inflation side as well.
Right. So, Madan, what needs to be done? So, there's supply side issues on both the supply itself and the pricing of it, both again external as well as internal, since we import a lot of oil, and plus we're talking about a potential hike in India. What could be the demand side management, if at all?
No, I think it's more left to the government as to what kind of a stance it is going to take. Now, personally, I would say in this kind of a situation, if you go in for a higher subsidy and make sure that inflation is under control to a certain extent, I think that would probably be the right way to go. I may probably be a contrarian out here because everybody is talking of reducing subsidies. I'm saying go ahead and increase it. But I think we are in a very, very vulnerable situation. We have a possibility of a poor monsoon, higher food prices. So at this particular stage, I don't think we can administer inflation any further. So I would be all for being a bit more flexible.
Are you saying that only because we are of the monsoon factor, and that's
it's
what
only
changed
because
your
of
mind?
it. But suppose our inflation rate was say 3 or 4% today, I would have said go ahead and rationalize all this. Like I think when we had the diesel price which was increased or calibrated by 50 paise or something per month, I think that was perfectly all right. It was something which the system could absorb. But today, if we're talking in terms of where adverse conditions do exist, until we get clarity on it, I think the budget would make sense for them to probably take on this burden.
Right. So how are you saying this? I mean, again, question is on the demand side.
I mean, I think how monsoon is not in our control, but the benefit from keeping inflation suppressed versus versus the cost has to be evaluated.
Okay.
I think there are certain fundamental drivers of inflation, and in India's case, the reason why inflation picked up was we had policies like minimum support prices going up by 15-20% per annum, rural wages obviously indexed to CPI inflation. That obviously led to rural terms of trade rising tremendously. And on top of that, you had suppressed inflation, and therefore demand for products where you had prices suppressed were rising much faster than actually the supply. A lot of this is reversing, right? I mean, the minimum support prices have started to come down, rural wages have started to come down. So I don't think we should be too worried about biting the bullet. If it has to be done, of course, everything, it has to be staggered and gradual, so that consumers can absorb it slowly. But I think it's important that the price signal goes, because if the price signal doesn't go, we will artificially be seeing higher volume than we can actually afford.
Right. So you're saying that even if we are looking at a situation which is a little more dire than before, thanks particularly to the delayed monsoon and all its attendant impact, we can still go ahead and bite the bullet.
I think a staggered approach is
but we should still do it,
advisable,
which is not what Madan is saying.
Yeah, I think it's. I think the burden has been quite high in terms of inflation on the public for quite some time. I think it's the third successive year. This will be the fourth year. So I think there's some kind of a responsibility which the government has to take. Because I think today our whole emphasis is on we want a low fiscal deficit. We want the government to spend on capital projects, infrastructure projects, and we want subsidies to be rationalized. But we should just remember that even though the subsidies can be better managed, but I think it affects a lot of poor people who actually require the support.
Okay.
Until the stage that we are able to actually improve our systems of delivery of subsidies, I think we a little more burden on the government.
So where will the money come from?
No, actually we already have a budget. We already know what the deficit is going to be like. Now what's been happening in the past is that since the government has not compromised on subsidies, what it's really done is it's cut down on the capital expenditure. That's a discretionary expenditure over which you have power. Now today the call is for, there's lots of hope and aspiration that the new government will actually start kickstarting these particular projects. So the thing is that, do you continue with the capital expenditure and also increase the subsidies? To my mind, you can do both of them and live at a higher fiscal deficit. So I'm all for saying that from 4.1, let's go up to 4.6%. Make sure that the 0.5% takes care of your capital expenditure projects, but also ensure that you're protecting the public to a large extent by not compromising on subsidies.
Okay, Sonal, we are running to the end of this segment. So if looking at two kind of situations, right? So one is things get worse with the external oil front. We are forced to increase it domestically, and plus there are a whole bunch of other things which go wrong, like the monsoon, for which we are already seeing the early signs. What can happen and what should we be doing? And the other side is, let's say, if there's a brighter side to it, monsoon comes back, hits us, Iraq problem gets resolved, somehow we find a solution or some delay in prices here, what happens there?
No, I think if we delay, passing on the price, the problem will show up somewhere,
okay. In
right?
principle,
I mean, whether
that,
it doesn't show up on consumer facing the heat, it will show up in, current account actually widening again. It will show up in fiscal deficit, seeing a higher deficit. So it's going to show up somewhere. It cannot be hidden under the carpet for very long. So I think, if there is an external shock and therefore under recoveries and subsidy bill is going up, which obviously will not leave much room for the government to spend on capex, then a staggered increase, is something that we should still go forward with. I mean, in the medium term, consumer demand cannot be propped up by artificially keeping prices suppressed. For that, real disposable incomes have to go up.
Great. So we've run to the end of the segment. Thank you very much for this, and we're going to come back and talk about jobs and employment. Stay with us. Hello and welcome back to Policy Watch. The India Exclusion Report 2013-14, released for the first time, highlights the plight of nearly 400 million workers in the informal sector. At a workshop held in Jaipur, academics, activists and former bonded labourers discussed poor working conditions and lack of access to workplace benefits such as social security, health insurance, unemployment insurance for these workers. The report says these workers of the unorganized sector are engaged in menial work or as manual labourers in the agricultural sector, small shops and establishments as domestic workers as well. They are hired and fired at will with no compensation or regulatory oversight. The report also said that the participation of women in India's workforce has come down to nearly 20% from 30% in 2005. It flags concerns on the high growth, low employment scenario of the last 2 decades. Between 2005 and 2010, on an average 2.7 million jobs were created every year against 15 million people that enter the workforce every year. Joining me now to discuss this are Sonal Varma, India Economist at Nomura, and Madan, Sabnavis, Economist at CARE. So we touched upon jobs and employment as an issue which is coming up. So the story here, of course, talked about some of the challenges faced by the informal sector. Let's talk about the formal and the informal sector. As important ingredients to the larger growth story, right? If we have to grow as an economy, we need to create jobs, but we also need people who can fill those gaps with the right skills and the right capabilities and so on. So, walk us through how you see the overall jobs and employment situation, and when get down to this specifics.
I think the underlying job situation, has been quite challenging, and despite 2004 to 2007 being such a high growth period, actually the job creation has not been much.
Right. So mostly jobless.
It has been sort of jobless, and if you see the sectors that are driving this, it's largely been the construction sector. The low skilled migrant worker, which has essentially got most of the jobs. If we have to get to the next, I think the key problem and not a problem, but the key challenge for India is, obviously if you look at the next 10 years and that 150 to 100 million workers are entering the working age population, A, of course, do they have the right skills, and B, not all of them can be employed in the construction sector.
Right.
So, which are the sectors where there can be more employment, and what needs to be done in order to increase the employment intensity of our growth process.
Right.
That's what the key challenge is.
Right. Madan, where do you see the flashpoints?
So actually, if you look at employment, I think there are two ways. We look at the organized labor and unorganized labor. So if you look at organized labor, I think if we want organized labor to improve, I think it's necessary that we should have sustained economic growth, and this should be driven by industry. I need to have manufacturing growth. I think that's where the jobs are really created. Otherwise, what's really happened, what we have seen in the past, at least last 3 years, I can see, is that there's been a lot of migration of labor from agriculture to the urban areas, but which is the area it goes back into your services. It could be in the construction area. I think that's been one of the major areas, as well as you can say low skill kind of jobs which are there working as coolies or something along in the urban areas, because agriculture has no longer become profitable. So we see a number of farmers actually moving over into the urban areas. So what we really see, that's one part of the unorganized labor. Then if you look at the corporate sector, if you're looking at the organized corporate sector, I think most people are trying to, in difficult situations, is to cut costs by cutting down labor costs. So one is that you have the average increase in your salaries has reduced. That's one way you do it. And the second thing is lots of downsizing which is happening. And if you look at the public sector, even they are also looking in terms of downsizing, trying to give off lots of contracts of lower level jobs to outsiders rather than have their own employment. So I think almost every organization today has become more conscious of the number of headcount, and I think that's also another thing which has contributed to low employment growth. So I would say we need to have manufacturing should grow, overall economic.
So you're saying that we basically need a massive demand side solution rather than
we need a demand side, and it should come from the manufacturing sector.
Right.
Where I think that's the only sector which can actually absorb this kind of labor.
But is that, a lot of people seem to be now saying that perhaps manufacturing is not going to be the answer to all our problems.
No, but I can't see any other thing, because if you're looking at services, say at one time we spoke of the IT sector which is generating, but that requires very specific skills. And when your entire demand for these kind of skills is related to what happens in the rest of the world, because there was initially when we had the euphoria, it was all about the US economy and IT specialists going out there. But today when we're talking of their own immigration laws which have come into being, as well as the slowdown out there, automatically there's a backlash which is felt.
We also need a situation where there is skilled labor, and skilled labor which is well taken care of, which also seems to be a problem as this report pointed out. How do we address that?
I think some of the issues that have been, some of the solutions that have been pointed out, of course, is that you have these vocational training institutes. We've started seeing some private sector itself, trying to skill their employees. But I think on a mass scale, there has to be huge focus on these vocational training, skill upgradation facilities, so that we generate the kind of workers we want going forward.
Right. So, Madan, do you see solutions at the scale that, or at the same scale at the problems that we are seeing?
No, I think we'll have to. It's going to be a very gradual process. I think we'll have to see the overall economic conditions have to improve. Only then can we see a commensurate increase in demand for labor. So this will happen basically as far as the organized labor is concerned. So it's not going to happen overnight, and I think we have seen a decline taking place over the last 10 years. Even if you look at the overall structure of employment, there's definitely been a migration more towards the services sector, and even in the services sector,
and that's where I guess the conditions become worse. In terms of, let's say, social security or health insurance and so on.
Absolutely. The moment you're getting out of the organized sector into the unorganized sector, then you have this kind of uncertainty also.
So, and do you have a view on how we could fix that? In a manner, or start to fix that?
No, I don't think it can be done physically. I mean, you can't really have a planned phase. This is something which is going to evolve as the system grows and develops. So we'll have to wait for the entire economic cycle to turn over, and only then will the jobs be created.
Okay.
See, what can be done when you're talking of vocational kind of jobs? Now, these kind of things are something kind of an infrastructure which we have to build up today, so that tomorrow when there is a demand for it, I have the right kind of labor which is available.
Right. Okay. So, Sonal, how are you seeing the, we all said that we would, or we thought we would grow at a certain rate as a country, but we didn't, and things slowed down. We're talking about a recovery today. For any recovery, you need a whole bunch of conditions and preconditions. So what are you seeing in those preconditions today in place, and what are you not seeing in place?
I think the preconditions that are falling in place is in terms of, one, policies are focused on macro stability. So for instance, like I mentioned, a more balanced approach to, rural versus urban as compared to a more skewed approach, which, such imbalanced policies cannot last for very long, because after some point in time they come and bite back. So I think the approach to overall, growth is much more balanced. And, for India, demand is actually not a problem. It's actually a very good problem to have. The problem is supply, and therefore if we focus on, and which is actually happening right now in terms of faster clearances, it's more about execution, and therefore if we focus on execution, which is essentially the supply, then I think the demand or consumer demand, which is actually a function of this, will automatically start to happen.
Right. So there's urban growth and there's rural growth. There's obviously been a huge migration from rural to urban. Traditional way of looking at it is that you have the urban growth centers or the engines of growth, and population migrate. Now that's not going to work at the scale that perhaps people want to migrate, right? So the solution could be that you need to find ways of ensuring people stay back where they are. Is that something that's...
No, I think that's something which has to be done, because if we're talking in terms of this kind of migration which we've seen, it's basically to the larger towns and cities, and they have their own kind of problems, because I don't think we have the urban structures which could actually take in this kind of labor absorption. So what we need to make sure that jobs are really created in the rural areas. We have to make sure that we have to look at alternative jobs rather than just agriculture. So normally what happens is...
Sonal, you agree with that? I just wanted to...
Yes, of course.
You do, okay.
So normally when we talk of rural, we always say you're a farmer, but there are lots of other allied activities which are there, which we need to develop skill sets there. And also we need to change the whole process of industrialization which are happening away from major cities like say Mumbai. You move over into the smaller towns, try and move into the rural areas. This is where the government can really come in by providing the kind of right incentives, so that we have a parallel kind of a system which develops, which also creates jobs for people in the rural areas.
Right. So, Sonal, we're talking about condition of, let's say, labor, informal sector and so on. But I mean, that's really let's say the outcome of something else, which is the ability to split opportunities between, let's say, rural India and urban India. What's your sense on this? I mean, do we need to look at new models or different ways of looking at the same thing?
I mean, like Madan said, we don't have the infrastructure in urban areas to absorb the kind of urbanization. Actually, if you look at India's urbanization rate, it's actually quite low as compared to what you would think at the current stage of economic development. So in the urban centers itself, upgrading existing urban infrastructure to absorb that migration has to be a game plan for the next 10 to 20 years. But simultaneously, we have to also ensure that in the rural areas, conditions are being set in place, that there are productive, gainful job opportunities that are opening up there also, and not everyone has to migrate, which means not just large scale industries, but also small scale sectors, small and medium sized enterprises, they opening up, why just agriculture, agro processing, various sectors that will actually probably pick up in the rural areas. So we probably need to think a bit outside the box. If there are, one of the key challenges of course has been labor policies are inflexible. So can we have, designated zones where you have relatively more flexible labor policies, which can generate employment.
Right. Madan, last sentence.
No, in fact, I would like to bring in this entire program of the government of Nariga. I think that's an excellent program. So when I'm spending 25 to 30,000 crores rupees every year, but I mean, initially you started off by saying that it's just giving cash to you to do virtually nothing. Okay. Now let's try and make sure that this same 30,000 crores can be used to create assets.
Right.
So if we're talking of creating jobs, which is what we should talk about, I think that's the right way to go. So that will be a very good start to make, because this is something which has been very successful. Of course, there have been lots of leakages out here also, but to the extent that we have a large number of people who have actually benefited, we can try and create jobs for them and try and make them more permanent in nature. So I think that would be the right way, and that could be the contribution of the government out here.
Right, and that could also ensure that the quality of labor and labor management is much better.
No, quality, I think, Govind, there's another broader issue about the kind of skill sets, the kind of education which we have. Because unfortunately, I think things are so much skill that unless you have a certain kind of an education, you cannot really enter the organized sector. So we have to live with that, live with the fact that we have a large amount of labor force who will never really qualify for the, I mean, I can't say the Wall Street like jobs which you have in Mumbai, but you'll have to try and find alternative jobs for them given the kind of educational backgrounds that they have.
But I think there are some interesting new ideas to look at, and that's what's important at this stage. Thank you very much, both Sonal and Madan, for joining us. That's all we have time for on this edition of Policy Watch. We're going to be back next week, same time. Thanks for watching.